Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maria Elena Perales, and on behalf of the Justice Conference of Women Religious Steering Committee, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the second session of the 2021 virtual JCWR Convocation Series. Our theme for this fourth session convocation is Justice in a World of Transition, Revolutionary Love at the Intersection of Racism, Migration, and Climate Crisis. In today's session, we will be addressing the issue of racism. The Justice Conference of Women Religious, JCWR, is a network of those who serve in the ministry of peace, justice, and integrity of creation for congregations of women religious. Our volunteer steering committee has worked over the past 2 years in planning this year's series. And I have to say that it's a joy for me to be part of this energizing team. We've worked very hard to put this on for all of us. JCWR strives to strengthen the voice of congregations of women religious for justice, peace, and integrity of creation. We do this by providing opportunities for the professional growth and development of those who serve in the ministry by facilitating networking, resource sharing, and collaboration. Today, we will take some time to look at the issue of racism. The 2 subsequent sessions of this convocation addressing migration and climate crisis will be held on March 11th and March 25th. As a reminder, we ask that all of our participants remain muted and please turn on your camera so we can see you. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be available to view again and share with the broader audience. I will now invite Jan Shively to lead us in a short reflection.
Hello, everyone, and it's so great for us to be here together virtually in this time of pandemic. It is strange and exciting that we can still be together. So I want to invite everyone to center themselves in silence as we reflect on the words of writer and civil rights activist James Baldwin from a prayer resource called Praying with Baldwin. Baldwin wrote, reflecting on the funeral of Martin Luther King Jr., "I have a childhood handover thing about not weeping in public. I was concentrating on holding myself together. I did not want to weep for Martin. Tears seemed futile. And I could not have been the only one, that if I began to weep, I would not be able to stop. I started to cry and I stumbled. The story of the Negro is the story of America. It is not a pretty story. What can we do? Well, I am tired. I don't know how it will come about. I know that no matter how it comes about, it will be bloody, it will be hard. I still believe that we can do with this country something that has not been done before. And so we pray. Take my hand, Lord, and carry me to the place of righteous suffering, if that is your will. Take my hand and carry me to the place of mourning with those who mourn, protesting with those who protest, and dancing with those who dance, even in the darkest hour. Release my captive heart, that I might accompany the brokenhearted. Open my clenched hands, that I might trade my violence for your gentle grace. Move my feet, that I might meet those who already march on the road to justice. Show me the way. Amen. I'm going to take just a few minutes to introduce our speaker and to sort of tie everything together. So our topic is Justice in a World in Transition, Transformative Love at the Intersection of Racism, Migration, and Climate Crisis. And as I started to begin to think about the theme, I began to ask myself the question, what kind of transitions is the world undergoing? What does it mean to be in transition? The global pandemic experience has laid bare the iniquities with and between countries at the cost of so many lives worldwide, but particularly people of color in the United States. The climate crisis has led to increasingly extreme weather patterns, the loss of livelihoods, property damage, and climate migration. The number of the world's displaced peoples grows due to violence, climate change, and poverty. Migrants face xenophobia and racism worldwide for seeking a better life. And as we look at these increasingly complex issues, we see how they overlap and intertwine, perhaps not so neatly as we would like. As I pause to breathe and simply try to grasp the scope of our complex and interconnected webs of life, I am at the same time excited and terrified about the opportunities to work for justice in the world we encounter each day. Perhaps to be in transition simply means to be hopefully afraid. But the transition I think I want to focus on, and we're all here to focus on today, is the massive heightened social awareness for racial justice in the wake of recent but not rare police killings of people of color. Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, before them, Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner. Last summer's mass movement stirred something new in us, and yet I would argue something that's quite old. To explore that, I think we need to think about the question, what is transformative love and what does it mean to practice it? As I think of our prayer earlier and Baldwin's words, as I think of all that I saw during last summer, I am pulled back to 2 points that Valerie Carr, who spoke in our opening session, made to us, and hopefully you had a chance to see that. First, that grief is the price of love. Loving someone means that one day there will be grieving, as Valerie puts it. Baldwin grieved for Martin specifically, but for Black America more broadly, a struggle Baldwin wrote about prolifically throughout his life. The protesters grieve for Breonna, George, Ahmaud, their families, for Black Americans, and the 400 years of history in this country. We should all grieve for people of color disproportionately harmed by climate change, health inequalities, and economic discrimination. Valerie notes that, quote, "We come to know people when we grieve with them through stories and rituals. Only by empathizing and trying to understand others' grief can we build authentic solidarity necessary for transformational love and justice." Secondly, Valerie tells us that rage is that which protects love. I think about the protests, the divine rage present there, seeking to reorder the world to protect Black lives so beloved, at least by some. Some critics were dismayed by the more radical elements of protests, and they lamented the property damage. But perhaps they revealed more about themselves and that which they loved than they would care to admit. I believe radical love calls us to understand that rage, and rather than stand in judgment of its manifestations, for us to understand where that rage comes from and ask ourselves, will we be outraged too? Lastly, I want to take a moment to talk about peace. Valerie noted on our last call how often people will use the language of peace to paper over demands for justice. As Dr. King wrote in a letter from Birmingham jail, he decries the white moderate who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. This desire for a negative peace is the desire to move into a post-racial harmony without ever dealing with the harm that has been done by society. If peace is what we desire, we must set our hearts on fire for justice to be done on earth as it is in heaven. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Briann Moye, pronouns she and her. She is a coalition coordinator with the Pennsylvania Climate Equity Table, where she is working to strategize and build statewide power with organizations of the multiracial working class to advance a just transition in Pennsylvania. Briann organizes at the intersection of racial, economic, and environmental justice outside of work, serving on the coordinating committee for Pittsburghers for Public Transit and the Pennsylvania Poor People's Campaign. Briann, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, John, for such a grounding introduction. I had to stop myself from crying visibly on this screen. And yes, I will just say one, I am just so honored and grateful to be in this space with you all this afternoon or early evening, depending on where you are in the world. And just very grateful to have a chance to share my work, my life, my pride and joy of organizing against systemic racism in Pennsylvania. And yes, with that, I think I can move in to my presentation, and also just want to share that John and I did not coordinate beforehand, but we are both moving into our openings with quotes from James Baldwin. And so it was also just really moving to hear. And so my quote actually comes from a period of time when James Baldwin was reflecting on the horror and terror of white supremacy in the United States. And he was saying, quote, "I'm terrified at the moral apathy, the death of the heart, which is happening in my country. These people have deluded themselves for so long that they really don't think I'm human. And I base this on their conduct, not on what they say. And this means that they have become, in themselves, moral monsters." And I wanted to open with that quote because for several reasons, but one, to just really ground ourselves in what I recognize as a moral movement that we all need to be taking part in this moment, to address not just the harms that racism brings, but the interlocking evils of racism, poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, militarism, and of course our distorted moral narrative that we have operating in the United States. And I think by the end of my presentation, it will become clear at least one vehicle for addressing this moral apathy that James Baldwin was noting many decades ago, but I do see as being very present still in the United States of America here today. So with that, I actually want to begin by sharing a personal anecdote. And this is just about a family member of mine, something that has been weighing a lot on my heart and my mind for these past few weeks. So I have a cousin, he's a Black male, and he's 28 years old. And a few weeks ago, he has just been presenting as being in the midst of a mental health crisis. And not only was he in a mental health crisis, but he was in a position where he was posing a threat to a lot of my other family members and a lot of people who love him and hold him dear. And just remembering the feelings of knowing that he was in crisis and not being able to do anything about it because folks couldn't access him, didn't know where he was. And also knowing that like he could potentially harm somebody was just very scary. But I think also like moving out of, you know, just like living through this political moment when we're seeing just the rise of police violence and state sanctioned violence against Black bodies. And this happening in occurrences where folks are really having mental health crises. If you look at like, the incidents where people are being abused by police, it's a situation where they should have had somebody else responding to their crisis or their situation in the first place. And just knowing that we were desperate for him to get mental health care because that's what he needed, but we didn't have a handle on him. And so things escalated. And now my cousin, at age 28, is in jail. And this is not his first round in jail. And so it's likely that charges that he has accrued from some of these more recent incidences will get bundled up with what he's had in the past. And this could wind up being a prison sentence for him. So just having a young Black male just like relegated to a life in prison, that's just something that's way too common in the African American community. But then also just a symptom of the systemic racism that is just embedded in the history and the fabric of the United States of America. So I just like want to recognize that the United States was built upon the structural denial of basic rights to people of color, establishing a system of white supremacy. And this system began with the genocide of indigenous people, and it began with the enslaving African bodies, African human beings. It concentrated economic and political power, and this is key, in the hands of a small number of people through the politics of oppression and division. And then while the laws, institutions, and outcomes associated with systemic racism have changed over the course of history, the inequality produced by it still operates today. And recognizing and engaging in collective resistance against this political order is essential for building power among all people who are harmed by oppression in America here today. And so I think that John did an excellent job at really grounding us in the year that we've moved through. And I think that I apologize, but I will be like repeating just a few points that you had raised. And so one, just recognizing that like addressing racism has definitely been brought to the forefront because of the uprisings that have occurred over the summer in 2020. And yes, all of them tied to the shooting death of Ahmaud Arbery, who was shot. The anniversary of his death was actually this Tuesday, February 23rd. He would have been 25 years old, I believe. I'm 25 years old. The shooting death of George Floyd in Minneapolis and Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky. And the deaths at the hands of the police of so many others. I could list names for several minutes, but also recognizing that these deaths galvanize what has been like the largest mass mobilization in the United States history. And so had the power of stirring so many people out of complacency and having so many people take to the streets in outrage and in grief. And especially in a moment whenever we're living through a global pandemic and we're being told to stay inside, but people recognize that like, no, like we have to be here. We have to recognize that something is profoundly wrong in this nation. And it's our duty to stand up and fight. And so just like wanting to recognize the energy that came out of that moment. And so that being just one clear instance of the way that systemic racism, however, is like operating in the US today is through state sanctioned violence in the form of police killing Black people and then not being held to account for it. Another way that we're seeing racism be so pervasive in this nation, and John pointed this out as well, is just like the relationship between the impacts of COVID-19 having like disproportionately impacting Black communities and communities of color. It's been shown that Black Americans have been dying at more than twice the rate of white people in this country. And a lot of that is just due to it's not because of your race that makes you like inherently susceptible to dying from COVID-19. It's extra factors that have been like a byproduct of our racist system. And some of that being the fact that there are more Black people who work as like essential workers, whether that is in like fast food or service industries. So I've been on the front line of this pandemic without adequate protections, without adequate wages, and in a lot of these positions, not even having access to health care. And so how is it that you're supposed to be able to take care of yourself and safeguard yourself from a virus whenever you're on the front lines and your employer won't take care of you and the state won't take care of you? We find that Black Americans disproportionately live in food deserts, and so you don't have easy access to nutritional food. And that means that like your body is therefore not necessarily as healthy as somebody who might have more consistent access to fresh, healthier options. We find that Black Americans live in environmental justice areas. And so living in a region where you are breathing in toxic air makes your lungs therefore like less likely to be resistant to COVID-19. And then of course, we're seeing the plight of COVID impacting all people who are incarcerated or in detention centers, and like just recognizing that Black people, but people of color in general, are just overrepresented in these institutions, and therefore putting them at greater risk of catching COVID and dying from COVID. And I also want to like acknowledge what's happening on the flip side. And now that we have a vaccine that's been distributed, recognizing that Black Americans are trailing significantly whenever it comes to COVID vaccinations. And the percentage of vaccinated Black folks is just far lower than their share of the population in like every respected like geography, whether it's in Pennsylvania or Mississippi. You're just seeing the trends show that people are being vaccinated so much less. And part of that is access. You don't have the means to get to where the vaccinations are. You don't have the necessary information. You don't have technology to get registered. There's so many considerations to take into account here. I think that what will happen is a lot of people will say maybe, you know, there's like this legacy of just like experimentation on Black bodies whenever it comes to just like medical trials. And I think that in the community, there is a weariness to taking this vaccine, but that by no means explains why we are trailing in such significant ways. That's an institutional failure. Another thing to look at is just, once again, just zeroing in on mass incarceration. And recognizing that over the past 50 years, the criminal justice system has become a critical institutional anchor of systemic racism. And tough on crime politics has led to skyrocketing annual federal discretionary spending on prisons, up to $7.5 billion in 2017, which is a tenfold increase over 1976. And so we always talk in organizing world, we talk about budgets as moral documents. And I think it's very telling whenever you see where we are willing to prioritize our spending as a federal or state government versus where we're willing to take funding from. Because you find that the money then gets removed from policies that are supposed to be there to support the poor and support the children and support the unhoused and support the hungry, and instead go towards our criminalization and incarceration and dehumanization. And then lastly, I want to, or actually not lastly, but I do want to bring in the connection between systemic racism and migration. And I think that the previous administration was just very explicit in terms of their racist anti-immigrant policies. Had stripped numerous protections for immigrants brought to this country as children, had attempted to ban migration from certain countries just due to the racialized bodies that live there. had dedicated billions of dollars worth of monies to building a border wall in Mexico, and had really ramped up deportation rates in workplaces and other spaces. And then once again, just this question of budgets as moral documents, recognizing that the Department of Homeland Security in 2003 had ICE, and this is when ICE was created in 2003. And initially had a budget of $3.3 billion. And in today's terms, the budget is around 8.3 billion. Same with Customs and Border Protection or Border Patrol. In 2003, they had an operating budget of 5.9 billion, which is still obscene. This is billion with a B. And now is operating at a high of $17.7 billion, which is invested in like ensuring that people can't flee like climate insecurity or food scarcity, and like just be safe and with their families. Like we're just dedicating so much resources to harming people and investing in these toxic systems. And I also just wanted to note that immigration detentions and prisons and jails are also rising. And I think what I was mentioning, that it seemed like it was especially cruel under our previous federal administration, especially with like the news of children being separated from their families and so many folks who still haven't been reunited. But I also want to recognize that the crisis of deportation and detaining migrants is something that continues no matter who is in power in this country. And even this week, there has been news about the Biden administration reopening a child detention camp in Texas. And it was actually a camp that used to house like oil workers. So, yeah, people working in oil fields has now been converted into a site for detaining children, unaccompanied minors in Texas. And so just like recognizing that this cruelty transcends party lines. And then the last example I wanted to bring into the space around how systemic racism is still pervasive today is just our continued violation of Indigenous sovereignty. And this being like so explicit in the struggle to save Oak Flat, which the federal government had granted this land to a Resolution Copper, which is a mining company. And it is trying to give them permission to mine copper on Oak Flat, which to the Apache people is a sacred site where they perform ceremonies, gather food, medicinal plants, bury their dead. And so just trying to, once again, like violate the sovereignty of Indigenous peoples is something that's like part and parcel with the history of the United States of America. And it's just integral into how systemic racism just continues to show up today. And so I wanted to outline those examples just to really give us like a shared grounding for how these issues have continued and how they continue to be present. And so like we have like an understanding of like what we need to be recognizing as we move forward. But I also recognize that like we are a group of people who have been doing the advocacy and doing the education and learning about these issues and are trying to find the best way to take action to address them. And that's why, once again, like I'm so grateful to be in a space with fighters and thinkers. And so I want to bring in the organization and the vehicle that I love most and that I dedicate so much of my time and heart and mind power to, and that is the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for a moral revival. So I think my objective here was always to be able to create a space for everyone to be able to take action as a result of what I share. And I, at the end of my presentation, really want people to consider just really like taking a plunge and getting involved with your state coordinating committee of the Pennsylvania Poor People's Campaign. The Poor People's Campaign, National Call for a Moral Revival, launched in 2018. And it's actually a continuation of a Poor People's Campaign that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. launched back in 1967 and 1968. And it was the last campaign that he would have run, or that he ran before he was assassinated. But the modern Poor People's Campaign is working to organize what we've talked about as the 140 million poor and dispossessed people in the United States of America. And we work to do that by organizing folks around the 5 interlocking evils that we see are present in our lives and our, like structuring our opportunities and our ways of living. And are also the evils that, are just emblematic in a system that works to dehumanize us consistently. And the evils that we've identified are systemic racism, which I've spent some time going on about, poverty, the war economy and militarism, ecological devastation, and our distorted moral narrative. And so a question that we often get at Support People's campaign is, why is it that we need a moral revival? What does that mean? And so I actually wanted to just take a moment to share a brief video. And it's of Reverend Dr. Liz Theo-Harris, who is the one of the co-chairs of the Poor People's Campaign National Call for Moral Revival, and also the director of the Kairos Center. And I will let her words kind of convey like what it looks like to do the work of a moral revival, and then I will respond accordingly. And so I will share this screen. I just want to make sure that I'm sharing the audio. Okay.
I just want to start by saying I'm stunned that basically we've had unanimous acknowledgement that poverty is widespread across this country. We have pulled a group of testifiers who are deeply personally impacted by these problems. They are in the room and people are not talking to them.
Oh.
People are not asking questions about how are we going to solve this problem of homelessness and an increased rate of evictions. And then people are being blamed for the problems that this society has caused. How is it that you can say the war on poverty failed when it is politicians who defunded that war? How can you say that Head Start is a personal charity when it has lifted 65 million children out of poverty since it was started? So it feels very important to me to say we need a real serious conversation in this country, led by those that are most impacted. And I love this question of, does the Bible say anything about what nations, what Caesars are supposed to do? Because Matthew 25 says, I was hungry to the nations, not to a church, not to a charity, not to an individual. I was hungry. And what did your nation do? I was homeless. And did you cut public housing? Or did you start building new public housing? I was homeless. And did you allow banks to be bailed out? But families who owe more on their houses than they're worth to become homeless. We have a moral crisis in this country. It is a crisis when 250,000 people can die every year because of poverty. And people in this committee can admit that in your towns there are people hurting. Well, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? Now. And when we talk about housing subsidies, we heard the power of them. You got a loan. You were able to get a house. That is government helping out. You were on food programs. That is the government helping out. We need more of these programs. We need to lift wages. How is it possible that in this country there's not one county where if you're working minimum wage, you can afford a 2-bedroom apartment?
Reverend,
So we got to connect this housing and this poverty and these wages and lift the load of poverty.
I always just find that piece so moving. And so what you don't see there is like, this was a housing like budget committee in the Senate. And so we had, I actually wasn't part of the campaign at this point, but there were a lot of people testifying to how immoral the budget that the federal government was trying to push was. And there was like somebody on the committee who was just basically not trying to have it and trying to just like pass the ball. And what I appreciate about what Reverend Dr. Alicia Harris is bringing is, one, like that moral clarity around like what is right and like how we need to be doing what is right. And how we know that what is right is going to be centering the plight and the misery of the 140 million poor and dispossessed people in this country, and will be working to lift them out of that misery. And another thing that I appreciate about that piece, because I have gotten into so many conversations with folks recently about the role of morality in politics. And so many people think that, like, there are some who are for it. And I think recently a lot of people who have been so denigrating towards the role of morality, like, how are we not supposed to feel we're not supposed to be human and doing this work and feel connected? Like, this work is like 100% about trying to change the hearts and minds of everyone. And what Reverend Liz is doing in that piece, for me, yes, she is railing at the Senate committee and she's speaking directly to them, but also she's speaking to every one of us and every person who hears her words. Because if we weren't convinced of like the immoral and the failures of the state prior to watching that video, I think that we have a sense of that now. And I think it's more about stirring up what's in our hearts and stirring up like our sense of injustice and that this is wrong. And so we feel compelled to take action. It's not about convincing those folks on the committee, because they know what they're there to do and they're not there to serve us. And we are at a point in this campaign where we recognize that too. But what we need to do, and what everybody on this call has to do, is be willing to carry this injustice and make the world understand this injustice and continue to convert people over to our cause, and to be able to like build the movement and do the work that is necessary of changing hearts and minds, so we can be that force to change the world for the better. And I think maybe that's a lot to get out of just 3 minutes of Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris, but that's how I feel every time I listen to that. I know like she might be talking to that committee, but she's also talking to every single one of us and stirring something up inside of us. And also just like making clear the moral crisis that we face and why we need a moral revival. So like another understanding of why we need a moral revival, and why I think everybody in this space can be the leaders of a moral revival, is just recognizing that the United States is operating with a distorted moral narrative, one that is rooted in like a white supremacist Christian nationalism. This distorted moral narrative is one that tells us that it's a sin to be poor, and not that the existence of poverty and that the existence of racism in the richest country in the world is a sin. And this distorted moral narrative is giving us like this sense that like caring for human beings is wrong. But the truth is that a morality that claims to care for the souls of people while destroying their bodies and destroying their communities is deeply immoral. And so that's why we need a Poor People's Campaign, a national call for a moral revival. And so before I come to a close, I actually just wanted to take some time to share some of the fundamental principles of this campaign, because I imagine that the principles that I'm going to list here will also be principles that resonate with you all and the work that you do in your communities. And so just wanting to share that the Poor People's Campaign, we are rooted in a moral analysis based on our deepest religious and constitutional values that demand justice for all. And we know that a moral revival is necessary to save the heart and the soul of our democracy. We are committed to lifting up and deepening the leadership of those most affected by systemic racism, poverty, the war economy, and ecological devastation, and to building unity across lines of division. We believe in the dismantling of unjust criminalization systems that exploit poor communities and communities of color, and the transformation of the war economy into a peace economy that values all humanity. We believe that equal protection under the law is non-negotiable. We believe that people should not live in or die from poverty in the richest nation to ever exist. Blaming the poor and claiming that the US does not have an abundance of resources to overcome poverty are false narratives used to perpetuate economic exploitation, exclusion, and deep inequality. And we recognize the centrality of systemic racism, and maintaining economic oppression must be named, detailed, and exposed empirically, morally, and spiritually. Poverty and economic inequality cannot be understood apart from a society built on white supremacy. And whereas the distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism blames poor and oppressed people for our poverty and oppression, our deepest religious and constitutional values insist that the primary moral issues of our day must be how society treats the poor, those on the margins, women, our LGBTQIA plus folks, workers, immigrants, the disabled, and the sick, equal protection under the law, and the desire for peace, love, and harmony within and among nations. We will build up the power of people in state-based movements to serve as a vehicle for a powerful moral movement in the country and to transform the political, economic, and moral structures of our society. We recognize the need to organize at the state and local level. Many of the most regressive policies are being passed at the state level, and these policies will have long and lasting effects past even executive orders. The movement is not from above, but from below. And then lastly, these are the last few. We will do our work in a nonpartisan way. No elected officials or candidates get the stage or serve on the state organizing committee of the campaign. This is not about left and right. This is not about Democrat or Republican. This is about right or wrong. And we uphold the need to do a season of sustained moral direct action as a way to break through the tweets and shift the moral narrative. We are demonstrating the power of people coming together across issues and geography and putting our bodies on the line to the issues that are affecting us all. Then lastly, the campaign and all its participants and endorsers embrace nonviolence. Violent tactics or actions will not be tolerated. So those are the principles behind the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for a moral revival. And I think more than anything, like that, for me, they're just so clarifying and helping keep me grounded in what it means to do moral work and why we need to be doing this moral work and like what it's going to take to do this moral work in a way that it's going to be of benefit to as many people as possible, and specifically to the 140 million that we continue to call out and lift up and deepen their leadership around in this country. And so before I close, just like John, I am going to bring in now a quote from Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Because I think that what I appreciate about today is like the opportunity to give a talk that is very much focused on systemic racism, but at the same time, I hope that like what I was able to convey is helping people begin to see that systemic racism, yes, like is a crisis in itself, but it's also something that is sustained in direct relationship to all of these other interlocking evils that the Poor People's Campaign is working to address. And we recognize that, you know, although systemic racism is a cruel system, at the same time, there are systems that are impacting people who are not people of color. And I just think to build a real moral movement and to build a movement that is going to encapsulate all of us, we have to recognize that, and we have to be like willing and committed to building movements that are going to unite us across our differences, building movements that don't want to paint over how we're different or how these systems treat us differently, because that is an objective fact, but like also trying to build a movement from what we have in common. And so with that, I will close with Dr. King's quote. And so quote, "The dispossessed of this nation, the poor, both white and Negro, live in a cruelly unjust society. They must organize a revolution against the injustice, not against the lives of the persons who are their fellow citizens, but against the structures through which a society is refusing to take the means which have been called for and which are at hand to lift the load of poverty. There are millions of poor people in this country who have very little or even nothing to lose. If they can be helped to take action together, they will do so with a freedom and a power that will be a new and unsettling force in our complacent national life. Thank you.
Thank you, Briann, for your powerful and personal testimony on institutionalized racism our nation has struggled and continues to be oppressed by. You share the inequities that have always existed, but now have even surfaced even to a greater extent due to COVID, such as unequal access to vaccinations. The injustice of the mass incarceration of our brothers and sisters of color, including immigrants. We are challenged by all these issues to continue to be present. We thank you for the opportunity to get us involved, and to take action through the People's Poor Campaign, the Poor People's Campaign, in addressing poverty within our marginalized communities. We are grateful to you for doing what is right, and we hope to find ways to work collectively to do what is right on our end. Thank you for stirring our hearts to continue to address the systemic racism that oppresses those on the margins. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So we now have an opportunity to ask questions. We can ask questions of Briann, and we have 10 minutes, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can. And just to remind you to ask questions, please use the raise your hand feature, which most of you can access by clicking on participants at the bottom of your screen. Others will find the raise hand function under the reactions at the bottom of your Zoom screen as well by clicking on the hand icon. If you have raised your hand, wait until we call on you to make sure to unmute yourself before you ask the question. Otherwise, all participants, we ask to please remain muted through the whole presentation. So, Ann McCarthy, would you please, you are muted, would you please ask your question?
Yes, Briann, thank you for that. Thank you for this presentation, and thank you for your work. I'm in Erie, Pennsylvania, and we have a local group connected with the Poor People's Campaign. My question is specifically about Pennsylvania, but it might fit to others. The political work at the state level is seemingly impossible right now on pretty much every area that the Poor People's Campaign is involved in, as you know. And I just wonder if you can give some examples of your hopes or strategies, or what you see in this really I mean, our state legislature is completely paralyzed, Republican controlled, and really difficult to work anything with. So your thoughts and strategies would be really helpful. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for asking that question, Anne. I really appreciate it. And I think that is something that we're wrestling with too, as because I'm a member of the Pennsylvania Coordinating Committee. That's made up of organizational delegates from maybe 9 groups across the state. And Yeah, and that's actually something I confront too as a coalition coordinator. Like everybody just feels like anything you want to move in Harrisburg won't happen. And my response to that would be, it all depends on like what is possible depends on like who you're trying to move, if that makes sense. And so yes, like I agree that it doesn't feel viable to like move any policies that would be like very transformative for the poor in our state. It's like it's locked by Republicans and they won't pass it. But at the same time, we do a lot of lobbying with Democrats, and some of them are also not in favor of the policies that we try to pursue. And so at the same time, like right now, the state committee is doing some work to really get ahead of this like budget fight that we have. And so I imagine in all of your states, there might be some push from your like state government to pass like an austerity budget. And so in times of crisis, when you don't have as much revenue, they decide that, you know, to cut spending, save money, that they're going to cut the discretionary spending that goes to social programs that poor people rely on the most. And so Medicaid is often on the chopping block. In addition to like funds that might go towards like housing or food assistance. And so what we are doing, like recognizing that, you know, the budget that we want and need and very much deserve is likely not going to materialize out of Harrisburg, is still doing the work to do the research and understand like where it is that we could come up with the money for our budget without balancing it on the backs of the poor and dispossessed in our state. And so that has been doing research around just like corporate entities that aren't paying taxes and ought to be, who is getting subsidized, like the fossil fuel industry. And so like we've been digging for money that we should be searching or taking for our revenue purposes. But at the same time, using this moment, recognizing that like we might not win in the chamber, but like our organizing is also about winning over the hearts and minds of the people. And so like we go into it and we actually approach the work recognizing that like a victory isn't always policy. Sometimes it is, but also a victory is trying to build our forces. And I wish I had this quote in front of me, but it's another Dr. King quote. I'll find it at the end of our conversation, maybe drop it in the chat. But what he's basically saying is that, you know, the poor need to, like if united, like we could build that powerful force that would make the like power structures of the society say yes when they might be desirous of saying no. And so I think that's actually our objective as the Poor People's Campaign, is to build the force that's necessary, and that is uniting people across all lines of division that can make anybody in power, whether they are Democrat, Republican, or independent, like recognize that like, oh, you do not want to mess with this nonviolent army is what we say. And so therefore, like you should make the decision that is in our interests. So that's what we're working to build. I don't think that we get caught up in recognizing that policy won't move, because we also are in the work of moving people. Sorry, that was a really long-winded answer.
No, it's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Anne. We now have Lisa Steiner. Please ask your question. We ask that you unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Briann, for what you've shared already. One of the things I'm especially concerned about is work and the loss of the millions of jobs that disproportionately affect people of color and immigrants. And I wonder, with the Poor People's Campaign, you know, this concept of the dignity of work or economic dignity, how that factors into your thinking about the importance of getting people back to work.
Mm-hmm. No, I really appreciate that question. These are such great questions. So one thing that I would say is that like with the campaign right now, I think this only kinds of answers what you're trying to say, but with the campaign right now, there has been like an ongoing mobilization. We've had these Moral Mondays every Monday since the beginning of the Biden administration. And everyone thus far, there's been a call to raise the wage. And so like definitely like pushing for dignity and work through higher wages is a priority of the campaign in this moment. And at the same time, I think with, so as we like moved in the global pandemic, the campaign had released a Jubilee like justice platform. And so it was like a series of demands that were meant to meet our needs in the midst of the global pandemic. And part of that is like, you know, the demand around like having like stimulus monies, and like recognizing that like this is also a moment when like we are encouraged by and large to like stay at home. And so like it's not that we don't want people to have access to like having a livelihood. That is not what I'm saying by any means. But at the same time, like if folks have been like cast out of work, like we need to make it so like you can still survive without having that work. And I think like that is the objective as a campaign. We're not trying to like build and so like we can immediately move people back, even though I think that's definitely like a medium term vision. We're trying to provide for our needs like as the conditions are right now. And I also will say that like as a campaign and then like the study that we do, we just recognize that like the role of work in our lives is going to be like very different over the next few decades. And I think like maybe even in our own lifetimes we've seen the role that like technological development has in displacing workers. And so I think that's always been a question, and like the pandemic is just a moment that has really heightened the question of like what do we do whenever like capital or employers don't need us to like physically work anymore. And so I think our vision, and that's why like we organize 140 million poor and dispossessed, because we recognize that like more and more people, whether they see it that way or not, are going to be falling within the ranks of the poor and dispossessed. And so like we center them in our struggles because we recognize that like this might be the generalized conditions of so many people in the US, especially as we look at tech development. So I hope that I'm answering your question. I can.
Thank you. I agree with you that we have to help people right where they are. And so the short term is urgent. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Lisa. And I believe we have time only for one more question. And I see that Mary Ellen Gondek is up, her turn's up.
Thank you, Maria Elena. And thank you, Briann, for your wonderful presentation. Very, very inspiring. I'm wondering if the campaign could offer us any direction for how to think about reparations and any direction that you might give us to help us move in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. I feel like just to be candid, I don't think that like the subject of reparations has been one on the agenda of the Poor People's Campaign. And so I don't think that I have like a very good answer for how to negotiate that in particular. I just know like generally, sorry, hold on. Excuse me. Like just recognizing the way that like resource and wealth is like flowing in this nation. It's like very much being concentrated at the top. And like, so we're seeking like a radical redistribution of wealth, but like a redistribution that is going to lift the load of poverty for all folks and not like a particular portion of the working class. And so, or the poor and dispossessed. And so I feel like I could do some digging and maybe like share with part of the committee about what the PPC does around reparations. But as of right now, I don't think that that's been like a policy priority per se for us. But thank you for raising that question.
Thank you too.
Thank you for asking your questions. I know there's some, Kathy Sherman, I hope your question is short, if that's okay, Kathleen. We'll give you a chance.
Thank you, Maria Elena, and thank you, Briann. I just, a question that I have, I was very concerned to read that 33 states are now relooking at voter registration after the election. And I'm wondering if the Poor People's Campaign is zeroing in on that somewhat as well. It's very disturbing.
Yeah, I can just say like broadly, because I don't know like the details of what's happening in all the states. I hope it's not happening in Pennsylvania. It's not on my radar if it is. But I will say that like whether it is like the demands that we initially listed as a campaign or the demands, our Jubilee Justice demands, because those emerged like as we were rolling into a federal election, like voter suppression is always like key to how we think about like addressing systemic racism in this nation. And so I can't tell you explicitly or like detailed way like how it is that we're going to be doing work around that, but I guarantee that it's not something that we're going to ignore.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your questions. And Briann has typed her email on the chat. And if you have a question, please feel free to send her the question and she'll be happy to answer your question. We now move to the next segment. And for that, I turn it over to John. Take it away, John.
Yes, we are going to be moving into some group breakout sessions where we are going to sort of strategize for action together. And so these breakout groups will have no more than 6 participants, hopefully, in each group. When prompted, you will need to please click join on your screen. These sessions are going to be self-facilitated, but when you do get together in your group, please assign someone in your group to be a scribe. And that scribe can type the group's notes in the chat. And we suggest that as you type the notes, not to hit return until you're all done, just to keep them all together there in the chat. And then when we come back into the main group session, the scribe will copy and paste their notes from the breakout room into the main room chat so that we can all see what was discussed in the breakout rooms. And those will be listed on the website, each group's sort of conclusions to the question. So without further ado, there are going to be 2 questions. And the first is, what are the opportunities to work on systemic racism? And the second is, how can we labor together to create the beloved community and affect systemic change? And so I think the first one's really asking you to get at what are some low-hanging fruit, or what are some opportunities that people have already recognized to work on systemic racism? And the second one is really challenging us together to think about what more can be done. And when I say we labor together, I'm thinking all of us in our individual capacities, but also certainly regionally or otherwise. You'll have 20 minutes to discuss these questions, and you will receive a notification when the discussion has 5 minutes remaining. You'll also receive a prompt to move to the second question after about 7 minutes. And I think that's all I have. So we're going to move into breakout groups now, and I hope you have great conversations.
Oh, right. Well, I'm sure some of us might remember some of the highlights from our conversation. So welcome back, everyone. I'm sure your conversations were engaging and enthusiastic. And now, so we're asking if anyone would like to share what was something that impacted you in your conversation, to, again, raise your hand and wait until we call on you so you can share with all of us. And we also ask that you please keep your thoughts concise so that we get more people a chance to share. And hopefully whatever notes are there, we'll be able to save them and share them on our website. Sorry about that, everyone. We kept going back and forth and we thought it would work. So anyone care to share? Okay, Anne, go ahead.
So there were many good things in my group, but one that really struck me and clearly came from Briann was that this is a moral issue, and therefore there's a moral imperative. This is not something we have a choice about doing. We have a moral obligation to do all that we can to dismantle white privilege and end racism.
Thank you, Anne. So now we have Maggie Conley. I know you, Maggie.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do. The one thing that came up for us was the importance of the intersectionality of the systemic racism across so many different issues. And so I wanted to put in that I shared a resource that I know we're using at the national level from Bread for the World. That's a racial equity scorecard, that you're really looking at how different policies are impacting different, communities of color and things. And so we're looking at it at the national level, and it has lots of implications for how you can use it at the state and local level as well. And I thought it might be a resource that hadn't made it outside of the DC area just yet. So wanted to share that as we're all wrestling with what that intersectionality is in our considerations.
Thank you. Thanks for your sharing. So now we have Phyllis Suspinchuk.
All right. We talked about how important it is to listen to other people's stories. And in that way, we're helping them in one way. It's not big, but it's part of what we should be doing.
Thank you. Very
Could you
good point.
repeat what she just said?
To listen to people and let them tell us their stories.
Very good. Thank you. Barbara Farr.
Hi. It seems to me that most of our congregations are pretty well immersed in legislative action. And so it seems to me that the next step or the next question that I have and the next thing that I want to learn about and get better at is the fact that we all live and move and have our being in white supremacy culture. And we all foster it all the time, both personally and in our congregations, inadvertently, but we do. So it seems to me that, well, what I want from LCWR and maybe the group here is how do we begin to recognize and transform white supremacy culture, both in ourselves and in our congregations, and then in the other organizations in which we live and move and have our beings.
A very good point. Thank you for your sharing. Anyone else? Fran, go ahead, Fran.
Yeah, actually, thank you, Barbara. You triggered this as something we spoke about this morning on our book club. We're doing white fragility as a community in our book club. I was reflecting this morning. I don't quite know how to say this, so please don't be offended when I say it. But I think as community of women religious, I know not everybody on here is a woman religious, especially the men, but that we have, I think, sort of sister supremacy in addition to white supremacy. It may not be something that we claim to ourselves or accrue to ourselves, but very often we know that we're given special privileges or whatever, looked upon kind of better than, higher than. I've just become, I think it's something I've been aware of for a long time, but more and more aware of it. The old kind of experience many of us have had probably over the years of, walking into a group of people whom we know and without a habit, but they know you're a sister, and you walk in the group and all of a sudden somebody says, damn or hell or shit or whatever, and says, oh, excuse me, sister, and there may be 5 other women in the group. So it's just, there's this sense that somehow, I guess what I'm trying to say is that, at least for me, it's like I have at least a double layer of supremacy to, peeling that onion. And I just think that's a conversation that maybe would be helpful at some point, some juncture to have.
Thank you, Fran. Yes, Betty, you need to unmute yourself.
This is kind of a response to the suggestion that what can LCWR or some other groups do for us. I have to, I don't want to offend anybody either, but I have to say that I think they're looking to us to figure this all out at the local or grassroots level. At least that's my experience. Things come down from LCWR to the region, to the congregations, but if the congregations don't pick up and do whatever the assignment or whatever is, it's not going to get done, because the people at the top, in fairness, have too much else on their plates. I mean, they're trying to deal with a whole other world of realities, and they really expect us to step up and take the initiative, not just us on this call, or not JP people, but the congregation level, I think, is where it's got to happen. Ian might have a feeling about that. Thank you.
If I could, and I can't speak for all of LCWR by any stretch of the imagination, but I don't know if you all know, I know your leaders know that LCWR has made a 5-year commitment to anti-racism work, to becoming an anti-racism conference. So the board and the staff and the regional leaders of LCWR are already involved in at least a 1-year, if not a 2-year process with the facilitator to take a look at ourselves, at the structures we've created for the conference, the policies, the procedures, and we've invited leaders to do the same with their congregations. Some congregations are way far ahead of where we are at the national level, and others have yet to begin. So there are supports, there are resources available to every congregation to use as is appropriate for them. We all have to do the work. We have to do it as an individual. We have to do it within our own congregations. We have to look at the structure of the conference of LCWR as the racist structures that exist there. We have to dismantle all of that. And we are not exempt from working at structural change in our local civic communities, our state communities, and our national community. I mean, we're also called to participate in structures like the Poor People's Campaign to help us dismantle the structures that create racism that's infected all of us. So there's plenty to do at whatever level you can do it, in whatever way you can do it. And nobody is going to do it for us.
Thank you. And then I thank you all I saw that most of us were able to type in our conversations within the groups. That's very helpful. And I believe Pat Murphy had a question. Mary Pat Murphy had a question.
This is Peg Murphy right here. I just want to thank you for this wonderful experience. And I did find the main speakers, her language is really helpful for me as presently I'm going to the county council to talk about housing. And some of the way she explained things, including especially the moral thing, maybe that's what I need to raise up. And the other thing is in the north, we're from Tacoma, Washington, and early 90s, 1990, I guess, Intercommunity Peace and Justice Center was formed. And I think our wonderful first director, Linda Haydock, I think you're listening, Linda. And we're on, I put the web address in the box, ipjc.org. And Mary Pat mentioned this, but IPJC is world known now, and through many of its programs, and it's a great resource for all of us. And we want to spread the word.
Thank you, Mary Beth. Thank you so much for your comments. Thank you everyone for sharing. And again, thank you for posting on our chat. We'll make sure we copy those comments and we share it. And remember, those will be posted on our website, as well as the link to this recording. I will now pass it over to John.
Well, thank you everyone for trying to keep it short, and we're mostly on time, a little behind, but I just want to thank you all again so much for being here together. I want to thank Briann for sharing with us today. I would invite everyone who's still here to use the chat box to type their own things to Briann. We're all going to send them at the same time, so we're going to take just about 30 seconds here to type your comment into the chat box, and then I'm going to count us down so that we can share and send all that love and energy Briann's way at the same time. So I'm going to give us maybe 10
don't
more.
press enter.
Yeah, don't press enter yet. All right, we're going to send our messages in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Well, Briann, I think I can speak for all, yeah, speak for the committee and everyone here in saying that it's just been so wonderful to have you, and your message has really helped us frame and think about this issue. Once again, I want to remind everyone that the session has been recorded and will be available on our website, jcwr.org. In the near future, along with the notes that were provided and some of the other things put here in the chat. There will be an evaluation coming to you shortly about sessions 1 and 2, and we really hope you fill those surveys out to help the steering committee get feedback. We really need you to, so that we can provide you excellent content in the future. And then also important to note that we still have 2 presentations coming up, one on migration on March 11th, and one on the climate crisis on March 25th, of course, from the same intersectional approach. Lastly, one more thing, just want to remind everyone to register for the 3rd and 4th sessions. If you haven't already done so, you can do that on our website, and we'll send out another invitation. If you've already signed up, you don't have to. Special thanks to Grace here, who has been running our technology and trying to keep up with our sometimes hectic presentation. I know I jumped around on the script a little bit, just thanks to her for keeping all tech things together. And thank you all. It's so good to see you. You have a wonderful evening, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.